The embers, they're almost gone. I made a mistake. I went past the tree line after midnight because the cold was freezing my joints. I gathered the fallen oak, but every time I drop a branch into the pit, a matching snap comes from the laurels. It's not an echo. It's matching the weight. It's waiting for me to run out of wood. Let me take you back to how it started. Let me take you back slow, so you understand what I didn't at the time. The ridge didn't have a name on any map I'd carried. Not on the paper one I'd folded down to a soft, dog-eared square after 3 weeks on the trail. And not on the phone I'd stopped trusting somewhere past the Virginia border when the signal had dissolved into nothing more reliable than a compass needle's quiet suggestion. The trailhead, registered 2 days south, had called this stretch of the Appalachian unmaintained past the seasonal closure, and whoever had penned that entry had done so in a handwriting that pressed hard into the page, like they wanted the indentation to survive after the ink faded. I hadn't taken that seriously enough. The cold had come in the way bad things often do on those mountains. Not with any ceremony, not with the dramatic dropping of a barometer, but quietly, gradually, the way a room goes dark when the sun moves rather than when someone flips a switch. By the time I registered the true severity of it, the temperature had already fallen past the point where my body was making reasonable decisions. My fingers had gone from aching to numb, and numb had started breeding into a kind of dull, foggy acceptance that should have frightened me more than it did. The lean-to shelter was nothing impressive. 3 walls of weathered hemlock planking, gray as old bone, with a corrugated metal roof that had been patched in 2 places with what looked like flattened soup cans, the rust bleeding down in long brown streaks like old tears. The 4th side faced down the ridge, open to the mountain, and on any temperate evening that open face would have felt inviting, a place to sit and watch the last of the daylight retreat behind the tree line. That evening, it felt like a wound that couldn't be closed. There was a fire pit at the shelter's mouth, a ring of round stones pulled from what I imagined had been a nearby creek, though the creek itself, if it existed, was buried somewhere beneath a foot of crusted old snow. The stones were black with the soot of 100 previous fires. Someone had been kind enough at some point in the warm season to stack a modest pile of split wood against the shelter's inner wall, sheltered from rain, the pieces cut clean and pale at their ends. Red oak mostly, and a little ash, dry as chalk. I didn't think twice about those pieces. I was grateful for them in the way you are grateful for small mercies when your body is approaching its edge. I built the fire with the last of my fat fighters, those paraffin-soaked cotton squares I'd been rationing since Georgia, and I fed that fire carefully, nursing it the way you nurse something fragile, And for a while, for perhaps an hour, things were fine. Things were quiet. The fog had come up from the valley below the shelter's open face, rising slowly, and had moved through the trees the way cold smoke moves, never quite settling, never quite dispersing, pooling in the low places and threading itself through the laurel thickets that crowded the slope on the shelter's left and right flanks. The mountain laurel out here grew the way it always does in the deep hollows, dense and low and tangled, the old trunks twisting around each other in configurations that looked almost deliberate, like something that had been braided rather than grown. In the dark, the laurels were a wall, a curtain. The firelight touched the outermost branches and stopped there, as if the darkness beyond had mass. The woodpile ran down faster than I'd expected. I want you to understand how cold it was. I want you to feel it, if you can, lying wherever you are right now, in your warmth. The kind of cold that settles into the joints first, the knees and knuckles. The cold that makes your hip flexors feel like they're wrapped in wet cement. The cold where every breath you take comes back to you tasting of iron and frost. And the simple act of existing begins to feel like labor. That is where I was. The stack of wood against the shelter's wall had diminished to a scattered few pieces, and the night was nowhere near finished. And the fog was thickening, and the cold was pressing inward from that open fourth wall with a slow, implacable patience. I knew the rule. Every hiker who'd spent any real time in Appalachia, who'd sat long enough with someone who'd been raised in those mountains, had heard some version of it. Don't gather wood after dark. Don't cross the shelter's perimeter past midnight. The old-timers phrased it different ways. Some spoke it as practical wisdom about deadfall and unstable ground in the black of night, about twisting an ankle out beyond earshot, about predators that moved in the small hours. But there was always something else underneath those practical reasons, something that the teller never quite named, a hesitation before the explanation, a looking away. I had heard it. I had filed it the way you file things that seem rooted in superstition when your rational mind is warm and fed and sitting safe inside a well-lit room. My rational mind was not warm. My rational mind was barely functional. My body was making the choices now. I pulled on my headlamp and my shell jacket, and I stepped past the ring of stones and out past the edge of the firelight, and then past the corner of the lean-to's side wall, and I moved into the dark at the tree line, with my eyes sweeping the headlamp's thin white beam across the ground, searching for deadfall. There was plenty. A windstorm had come through here sometime in the autumn, it looked like. and the oaks at the edge of the tree line had shed liberally. Long branches, thick at the base, some of them still dense with dried leaves that rustled as I dragged them. I made 3 trips. I worked quickly, the way you work when the cold is biting at the back of your neck and the dark beyond your headlamp feels close. I didn't look into the laurels. I gathered what I could, and I went back inside the circle of firelight, and I fed the fire until it was speaking again in that low, settling voice that fires have. The relief I felt was physical, a slackening. I crouched close to the fire and let the heat move back into my hands, and I listened to the wood catching, the small ticks and pops of moisture releasing, the low breath of the flame. And then I dropped a thick branch into the pit. The sound it made was the hollow, resonant knock of dense oak striking the stone ring's edge before it settled into the bed of coals. A particular sound, weight and density together, a sound with a specific grammar. I was still crouched when it came back. From the laurels, not 12 feet off the shelter's left flank, the same sound, not similar, not approximately the same sound, produced in the same moment of silence that followed my fire feeding, in the same tonal register, carrying the same sense of mass and impact as the branch I had just dropped. I told myself it was an echo. I straightened slowly and tilted my head, and told myself that the ridge behind the shelter was catching the sound and returning it with some compression, some fold in the geography that made echoes behave strangely up here. I'd heard of that before. I'd read about acoustic phenomena in mountainous terrain. I was a rational person. I waited a long while. The fire steadied. I reached for a small piece, a thin, dry stick, barely worth the name of tinder, the kind of piece that snaps in your hand when you bend it. I held it over the fire and let it fall, a tiny, brittle snap from the laurels. Immediate, proportional. I set my hands on my knees and I looked at the woodpile, and I thought about what I was doing. I thought about it carefully. I thought about the distance from the laurels to the shelter. I thought about what the space inside those tangled trunks looked like in daylight. Low and lightless, the branches interwoven, the dead leaves matted on the ground in deep, damp layers. I thought about what would have to be inside that space to produce sounds like that. I thought about its hands, if it had hands, pressed flat into the cold ground, adjusting its weight in response to each piece I fed to the fire. My next breath came out unsteady. I picked up a piece I had been saving, a heavy, round section of branch as thick as my forearm, dense as a hammerhead, the kind of peace that falls from a tree with a sound that carries half a mile. I held it in both hands above the pit for a long moment. I was testing something. I was conducting an experiment I did not want to conduct. I let it drop. The thud from the laurels came one breath after, deeper than anything that should have been made by a branch, a sound that seemed to come up from the ground itself, as if something of considerable mass had shifted its weight forward. And it was closer, not by much, but closer. That is when I understood that it was counting, not just mimicking, counting, keeping a running inventory of what I had left, measuring the distance between this moment and the moment the fire died. It knew what I had brought back from the tree line because it had been there in the dark while I gathered it. It had watched me work. It knew the exact dimensions of my woodpile the way a patient thing knows the capacity of what it is waiting on. I sat very still. I did not move for a long time. The fire did not wait for me. Fires never do. Piece by piece, with the deliberateness of someone disarming something, I fed the pit. Each piece brought a response from the laurels. Each response was a fraction closer than the last. Not rushing, never rushing, just tightening the perimeter with a slow geometry that was almost mathematical in its patience. The fog had moved up fully onto the ridge now, thick and white in the firelight, and beyond the circle of orange warmth, the world had become a formless gray-white nothing. And somewhere inside that nothing, the laurels stood. And inside the laurels, something crouched and counted and waited. I could smell it, I think. Or perhaps I was only imagining that I could. The air coming off the left flank of the shelter had taken on a quality, deep and wet and rooted, like the underside of old bark, like the smell of a place where standing water had rotted something large down to its bones, and then the cold had preserved what was left. There are smells that the human body responds to before the mind catches up. My body had already responded. My hands were not shaking from the cold anymore. The woodpile was 5 pieces, then 4, 3. With 2 pieces left, I stopped feeding the fire and simply sat with my arms wrapped around my knees and watched the coals. They were still bright, orange fading at the edges to red, and the flames were low but present, casting just enough light to make the open 4th wall of the shelter into a bright rectangle, and the world beyond it into a flat black painting. There was no sound from the laurels now, no sound at all. Not the settling of branches, not the movement of small animals, not even wind, though I could feel a cold breath moving through the shelter from somewhere. The silence had a quality to it, a fullness, the way a room sounds full even before you turn the lights on and see someone standing in the corner. 2 pieces, then 1. This is where I am now as I speak these words into this recorder for whoever finds it, for whatever that is worth. 1 piece of wood left, held across my knees, and the coals dying down from orange to something darker, something that gives off heat without light, and the cold already reclaiming the edges of the shelter, working in from the corners. I have been sitting here a long time, trying to think clearly. If I put this last piece in, the fire will have another 20 minutes perhaps less. And the sound that comes back from the laurels will come from just outside the firelight's edge, just outside, where the orange stops and the dark begins. If I don't put it in, the fire dies sooner, and the dark is the same dark either way. The coals are dim now, that deep pulsing red of something spent, something that has given all it has to give. I can feel the cold on my face. I can feel it on the backs of my hands. The fog is thickened so completely that I can no longer see the tree line. Even the shapes of the nearest laurels have been swallowed. And there is only this, the small, warm circle around me, which is growing smaller, and the dark, which is not. There is no sound from the thickets. That is almost worse than the sound was. I am holding the last piece of wood in both hands. It is rough-barked and cold now, heavier than it felt when I carried it out of the dark. The fire is asking for it. I can feel the heat pulling at it from below, the way a flame reaches. I think I understand now what the old rule was protecting. It wasn't about safety. It wasn't about deadfall or broken ankles or predators that move at night. The rule was a negotiation, a boundary, a line drawn not in the dirt, but in time. Midnight, as a threshold, as a door that once stepped through cannot be unstepped through. I stepped through it. The coals are the color of dying rust now, barely glowing. The cold has reached my shoulders. I am looking at the last piece of wood. I am looking at the dark beyond the shelter's open face. And in the silence I can hear, or perhaps only feel, something adjusting its weight, settling, waiting. Sleep well now. The fire is still burning. You are warm. You are inside. Whatever moves in the laurels tonight, it is not counting your wood. If the mountains call to you tonight, subscribe. There are darker hollows yet to wander, and I'll be here, waiting at the next shelter down the trail. And if you heard something in the dark while you listened, leave it in the comments. You wouldn't be the first.